And joining us now on the debate in Washington, D.C., Wade Davis, explorer in residence at the National Geographic Society. Also in Washington, Susan Casey Lefkowitz, director of the International Program at the NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council. In Calgary, Alberta, Philippe Riker, vice president of external relations for the Canadian Energy Pipeline Association, and Janet Ansley, vice president communications at CAP, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. And it's good of all four of you to join us in various locations around this continent for a discussion on pipeline politics. Janet, I'll start with you, and I wonder, when President Obama rejected the application by TransCanada for the Keystone XL, I wonder, first of all, how surprised were you to hear about that?
Well, we knew a decision was coming, obviously. We're disappointed with that decision, but we're encouraged that it was clearly not on the merits of the project. So we know when we talk to Americans, we do lots of public opinion polling in the United States, that most Americans, about 80%, actually favor Canada as the source of imported crude oil, as long as the U.S. is using oil. So we're hopeful that when TransCanada reapplies, that based on the solid merits of the project, it will be approved.
Susan, we heard that just now that Janet was saying the project was not turned thumbs down on the merits. Why do you think it was turned thumbs down then?
You know, Congress had passed a bill saying that the president had to make a decision on the Keystone XL tar sands pipeline within 60 days, and that simply wasn't enough time to do the additional review that was needed, especially when the full route of the pipeline through Nebraska hadn't even been determined yet. And so the president really had no choice but to reject the pipeline, but he did do that by saying that the pipeline was not in the national interest. It'll be interesting to see if TransCanada does reapply. All the same public concerns about the safety of the pipeline and the risks of climate change to Americans from expansion of tar sands oil extraction, they all will still apply the second time around.
Wade, you're right there in Washington, D.C. We certainly heard a lot of chat up here about President Obama turning thumbs down because he doesn't want to lose support from people like you as the November election approaches. How much do you think that was a part of his decision?
Well, obviously, I'm sure it was a political decision to some extent, as all these decisions are. You know, my concern is really not for or against the pipelines. I mean, even though I'm often seen as an environmentalist, I actually work as a personal advisor to Ray Hunt, the owner of the largest private oil company in the world. And I was advising him on his Camisea pipeline, which was an exemplary engineering project. I think the concern that many of us have, and I am from British Columbia, and my own homeland is going to be directly impacted, not just by the Enbridge proposal, but by the peripheral projects that will feed into the tar sand extraction, such as coal bed methane exploration and extraction in a place we call the Sacred Headwaters, where by a remarkable accident or wonder of geography, three of our most important salmon rivers of British Columbia, the Stikine, the Skeena, and the Nass, are all born within the same meadows. And yet Royal Dutch Shell, or Shell Canada, has a proposal to extract coal bed methane from 6,500 wells over a tenure of roughly 1 million acres, which we are deeply concerned about because this is one of the most iconic and beautiful places in Canada. It's known as the Serengeti of Canada. So I think the issue isn't, you know, pipelines or no pipelines, or oil extraction or no oil extraction. Like anything else, it's oil wells and mineral development, where, at what pace, and for whose benefit. There's lots of good places to secure oil in the world, and there's certain places we should not go. And to drill for oil, for example, or coal bed methane gas at the headwaters of the sacred rivers of British Columbia in those meadows is rather like drilling for oil in the Sistine Chapel. It just shouldn't happen. So I think that's our biggest concern in Canada, at least in the West.
Okay, let me go to Philippe then with this follow-up. There's every indication that TransCanada is going to reapply and just change the route. If they change the route, do you think that that would find more favor in the environmental movement?
Well, I don't know if it would necessarily find more favor with the environmental movement, but certainly this project already has gone through three significant environmental assessments, and 3 times that assessment came back that said that this project actually had very little adverse environmental impact. I'm quite certain that obviously if they were to reroute, it would make that project even more palatable for some. But fundamentally, I think the issue is way beyond the safety of the pipeline. Pipelines are fundamentally safe modes of transportation of energy products. It's been, we have a long track record of that in North America. And the Keystone project, frankly, is just part of an ongoing infrastructure development that has been going on for the last 50 years.
Susan, would you follow up on that insofar as if they change the route and if it had already passed some environmental assessment, should you therefore not have a problem with it if it comes back with a new map?
You know, the fundamental fact is that this is a new kind of pipeline for the United States, and we don't have the regulations to deal with it. Transporting diluted bitumen through a pipe is very different from conventional oil. We saw it with TransCanada's first Keystone pipeline, which in the US and Canada had over 30 leaks and spills in its first year of operation. And we also saw it in the tar sands oil spill in the Kalamazoo River in Michigan, which they're still cleaning up a year and a half later. So I think that wherever this pipeline goes, people all along the route in Texas and Nebraska and Montana and the other states have real concerns about their farms and waters. But even more, as Philippe mentioned, this is a bigger issue about where we're going with our energy future. And we think that we can do better in terms of our jobs and our national security, not just in the United States, but in Canada as well, by diversifying into clean energy and having clean energy really be what the next play is in terms of how we move ourselves around and how we light our homes and buildings.
Okay, Susan, but you're going to forgive me if before we get to the bigger picture, I'm going to stay with the smaller picture for a little longer, and that is, let me go back to Calgary for Janet. Janet, is there no way that the existing pipeline infrastructure could do the job?
Well, firstly, the existing pipeline infrastructure does today carry oil sands crude. So what Susan just said is categorically false. That there are existing pipelines carrying oil sands crude from Canada today. And in my home of Alberta, we've actually been carrying oil sands crude around the province of Alberta for some 40 years now. So when transported, bitumen synthetic crude has the same qualities as conventional crude. It is no more corrosive. These scary notions that the environmental community would like you to believe just are not true. So we can actually expand the existing pipeline network that does today carry oil sands crude into the United States. That's one option that producers in the pipeline industry are looking at. And certainly that's what will be done in the near term as TransCanada assesses what it wants to do with its application.
Okay, Susan, she just took direct aim at you there, so I'll give you a chance to come back before I move on.
Sure. Tar sands oil, especially in the form of the raw form of diluted bitumen, has not been transporting the United States for that long. It's been relatively recently that it hasn't all been refined up in Canada, but that more and more has started to come to the United States, both through the existing pipeline system and through newer pipelines, mostly at this point to our Midwest. What the Keystone XL pipeline is primarily meant to do is to divert tar sands oil from the Midwest to the Gulf Coast so that the oil industry can get higher prices for it on the world market. We have enough pipeline capacity for decades to come to transport even a growth in tar sands oil into the United States. But that's not what the Keystone XL pipeline is about. It's about being able to actually raise oil prices in the Midwest for the tar sands oil industry and give them a market to export.
Here's what somebody else had to say about Keystone XL. Her name is Naomi Klein. I suspect all of you know of her. And back in November, she had this to say about this project. Roll tape, please.
So here's the other thing they're telling us. They're telling us that this will create jobs. And how dare we stand in the way of jobs during an economic crisis? We know that the same economic logic that puts greed above all and liberates corporations, that same economic model that is threatening to crash the global climate system is exactly what crashed the global economic system, which is why we don't have enough jobs.
Okay, Philippe, that's a little piece of her video. What do you think of the point she's trying to make?
Well, I'm not exactly sure where Naomi Klein is going with that particular
I'm just sitting here waiting for Philippe's head to fly off and a pipeline to come out of his head, like happens in that video.
But I think
that's about as believable as the video is.
It's those comments to me are somewhat completely out of place. I mean, what are we talking about here? We are talking about providing energy security for Americans via a pipeline that is incredibly safe through a sector that has shown over decades that we are very safe. Going back to some of Susan's points, there are right now in the US some pipeline systems that are carrying California crude that are very similar in terms of properties than diluted bitumen. And I haven't heard of any significant issues, if any, of those particular pipeline systems. At the end of the day, what we're really talking about here, and this is why I think this is wonderful to have this discussion, and to provide some context, this is really has nothing to do with the pipeline. It's about a bigger issue around energy use and energy choice. And by the way, having a pipeline does not mean that we are not in favor of having additional renewable energy in North America. Those are not zero-sum games at all. In fact, I would argue by having the prosperity through oil and gas that would allow us to actually invest in those new technologies, we'll be much better off at reaching some of the goals we're trying to reach from an environmental sustainability perspective. So I think in many ways we have to look at this in a much more holistic way. And if we do so, it is a question of balance, and I do think we can find the right balance.
Wade, would you take on that argument about whether or not you can walk and chew gum at the same time? Doing this pipeline deal doesn't necessarily mean, Philippe suggests, that you can't also
right. I mean,
go after renewables.
Agree. I mean, I don't, of course, and I don't think it's an issue really of the integrity of the pipeline or the hazards of the flow of the bitumen-produced fuel. I think the challenge here is that we know that no matter what we do in the lines of renewables, those alternatives are to some extent compensated by or overshot by growth of the economy, growth of the population. So there's no question that for the foreseeable future, carbon-based fuels are going to be a big part of the energy picture, whether you like it or not. I think we have to step back and look at the bigger issue here, and that is the fact that I think all of us thought that as conventional sources of gas and oil decline, there'd be a kind of magical shift to some kind of new form of energy, whether it was renewable, wind, solar, even nuclear. But there was this sort of sense of the inevitable shift that to some extent mitigated our concerns about what the overwhelming consensus of the climatologists is telling us about climate change. I think there's a kind of a moment now where the move toward so-called non-conventional sources, be it shale, be it coal bed methane, be it oil produced from tar sands, this suggests a possibility, and indeed the certainty in North America, that we may be embracing a carbon economy for another 100, 150 years. And the thing we should be concerned about is that if the scientists are right, and if this overwhelming consensus is accurate, then we really should be worried about what this will imply for a climate which is transparently changing before our eyes. Those who deny the scientific consensus, in some sense, are denying modernity itself, because all of modernity has been built on our faith in the scientific methodology, and it's precisely that methodology that has caused such concern among climatologists. So what I see happening in Alberta and Western Canada is not necessarily a kind of holistic embrace of energy alternatives as much as an absolute stampede to exploit the tar sands to the maximum extent that we can.
Okay, and but let me get Janet in here on this issue. Obviously, framing this debate, trying to find a consensus about what this debate is actually about is a difficult thing to do, but one of the frames that's around this debate is those who want these projects to go ahead make some excellent arguments about the amount of jobs it will create over the next few decades and the revenues that national and provincial treasuries will realize over that period of time. However, environmentalists are saying that's all well and good 3 decades out, but you're going to ruin the planet forever. And that's the argument they're making. Would you, that's one of the arguments they're making, one of the frames they're putting around it. Could you speak to that, please?
Well, that's one of the frames they're putting around it. We believe when we look at the energy mix going forward, and our members include very big multinational companies down to tiny, mom and pop kind of producers. But when we get a consensus from our membership on what the energy future looks like, it very closely matches what the International Energy Agency and others believe, which is we will be dependent to some degree on oil, natural gas, and coal for decades to come. And decades meaning 50 plus years. At the same time, we need to dramatically increase the amount of renewables that we use as part of our energy mix. Yes, we've got the a huge amount of oil in Alberta. We have also got we're the per capita, the largest producer of wind power in Canada. So we recognize within our own province and within our own grid and energy supplies that we need both. And that is going to be on a global scale. So if we look at today, according to the IEA, that renewables are about 7% of our energy mix globally. If we're going to double those, actually double the amount of renewables to 14% of our energy mix by the year 2035, that is going to require an astronomical amount of effort. In the meantime, energy demand overall is going to double. So we're between a rock and a hard place in the energy industry, and we do need resources such as the oil sands, as well as tight oil and shale gas. So we're running faster than ever just to keep up with what the global demand is telling us, and renewables will be an important part of that for sure.
Okay, Susan, let me start with you in getting all of us to change our focus from Keystone XL to the Northern Gateway pipeline, which of course is only in Canada and goes towards British Columbia, which is Wade's home province, as he's told us. That one's TransCanada. This one, Northern Gateway, is Enbridge. And Enbridge, Susan, has promised that not only will it meet all of the legal requirements that the regulations suggest today, but they'll go above and beyond all that. Would that satisfy you as to the environmental appropriateness of this project?
I think one thing that we've seen in the past years, especially looking at the BP Gulf oil spill and the Enbridge spill of the tar sands pipeline into the Kalamazoo River in Michigan, is that we can't just rely on oil companies to do what's best for us in terms of protecting our health and safety. One major problem with the Northern Gateway pipeline is something that I hear people in British Columbia saying all the time. It crosses major rivers, it crosses through so many communities, it crosses places where people fish and depend on the land for their livelihoods. The tankers would be coming into an area which is difficult to navigate, and the chance of oil spills there and accidents would be great. Basically, this is a pipeline and tanker traffic that the people of British Columbia have been raising severe concerns about, and we see that when we see to what extent they've been turning out to speak at the community hearings that started earlier this month.
So under no circumstances should it be built, period, full stop?
From our perspective, this is a pipeline that is not necessary, and given the very grave concerns of especially the people who live along the route of the pipeline and the tanker traffic in British Columbia, I don't see that this pipeline will be built. I don't see how it can be built over the very strong objections of the people who live there and the First Nations.
Go ahead, Wade, follow up.
I think Susan's point's well taken. I mean, to some extent, the people of British Columbia have spoken, and they've spoken loudly and with almost a united voice of opposition. And when we speak of projects going through environmental assessment processes and proper regulations, British Columbians tend to look rather critically at that. I mean, we're so used to mining developments flying through these processes, which really are just window dressing. A case in point, for example, is the extension of the Northwest Transmission Line, a $404 million project to extend the grid of BC Hydro into the northwest quadrant of the province, where there is no link to that system. And the $404 million is being spent to build and extend the grid to nowhere. It goes to a lake where there's nothing but a highway yard at this point. But $130 million of that $404 million is money that came from the Green Fund of the federal government that was specifically allocated to facilitate the greening of our economy. And the money has been spent to extend the grid to nowhere with the rationale that eventually it will get a couple of small indigenous reservations off diesel generating power. It's a ludicrous rationale. What is actually happening is that the government is paying with taxpayers' dollars to extend the grid to a point where a plethora of mining companies will be able to bring their own lines down, plugging into that grid. There'll be no talk of subsidies, there'll be talk of private investment, but in effect it's a massive federal subsidy for small mining companies that could not go ahead without that subsidy.
Okay, so let me get Philippe in here. I've got to make sure I keep the time equal here. Let me get Philippe in here to discuss this. We've talked about some of the environmental concerns with Northern Gateway. There are also First Nations concerns, Philippe, and I wonder how likely this project is not only to jump over the hurdles that environmentalists suggest ought to be there, but the hurdles that potential lawsuits by the First Nations that they may bring to bear, when they consider what their role in this ought to be. Could you speak to that?
Well, I can certainly speak to that, but what I'd like to do again is provide a bit of context for British Columbia. I mean, British Columbia today has approximately 8,000 kilometers of transmission pipelines that are crisscrossing that particular province. So obviously from a sector perspective, we are very capable of operating in a difficult terrain and environmentally sensitive areas. So that's one thing, and we have the track record that shows it. On top of it, you know, coming back to some of Wade's comments, the National Energy Board is a world-class regulator that really ensures that whatever project is approved has the best available standards in safety, in constructability, and obviously takes care of the issues that are raised by the local populations. Coming to the First Nations, absolutely, I mean, Wade is right, and you are right. It is in BC, it is a more complicated matter because the treaties have not been signed by many First Nations. On the other hand, again, the pipeline sector, because of the geographical scope of that sector over the years, has had tremendous opportunities and success in actually working with Aboriginal groups across Canada on numerous projects. So again, I feel that this is something that can be overcome.
Well, let me get Janet to discuss this. We just heard the National Energy Board, I think Philippe described as a first-rate organization. I think it's also the case, though, that when the federal government of this country doesn't like something the NEB rules on, it intervenes and just overrules it. So how helpful can the NEB be in this situation?
Well, the NEB is the primary regulator, and we look to them to run the public consultation, to manage, to ensure that the pipeline proposals or any proposals that go before the NEB meet the standards. And there certainly is a history where the NEB has said that projects perhaps were not, their time was not to come, that the federal government has intervened and said that, you know, these are projects that are actually in the national interest. There's a value beyond just what you see in one particular region. That does not mean, however, that any environmental or social outcomes are missed, that the environmental performance is at the regulatory standard, the benefits that are required to be returned to communities and given to communities along things like pipelines, right-of-ways are still enforced. The fact that the federal government wants to put a consideration above and beyond what a specific regulatory body has to consider does not mean that environmental outcomes and social outcomes are not maintained.
Okay, but Susan, let me get you to follow up on that, because if the National Energy Board is, you know, as Philippe said, highly regarded, and it goes to the trouble of holding all of these hearings, finds out what the public believes about all this, makes a ruling, and then the federal cabinet comes in at the 11th hour and basically says, we really don't care what you just went through, here's how it's going to be. How helpful is that really at the end of the day?
Well, I think that the fundamentals of any democracy, whether in the United States or Canada, is listening to what the people want. And it's very interesting how people both in the United States and Canada, and in fact around the world, as they learn about the dangers of tar sands extraction and transportation of tar sands and pipelines, are saying that's really not the right choice for our energy future. We can do a lot better, and we can actually meet our economic needs and our security needs better with cleaner energy. And I think that that's really what is at the heart of this, that the people of Canada and the people of British Columbia, the more they learn about this project for a pipeline and associated tanker traffic, they're just saying no and raising very real and strong concerns.
Well, Wade, let me get you to pick up on this, because I don't mean to sound insulting here, but the people want the lowest possible taxes and the best possible services. They want the most jobs created possible. They want the best environment. They want their oil flowing as well. The people want, you know, everything. At some point, somebody's got to choose. What's the choice here?
I don't think that's really the case, or what we're talking about. You know, what we, those of us who live in Northwest British Columbia, what we're concerned about is it's not simply a matter of a pipeline or even the fate of the tar sand or oil sand development. If you get onto Google Map, and my mother was born in Calgary, my family's from there. If you get on a Google Map and you plot down any quadrant in Alberta or Northeast BC, there is no inch of land which is not carved apart by seismic lines, roads, drill sites. It's a total industrialization of the wild. Now, where we live in Northwest British Columbia is as beautiful a place as exists on the planet. And we have mountains that are the home to the greatest population of ungulate species in the world that are about to be torn apart to produce copper to sell it to the Chinese. We're watching this kind of tsunami of industrial development coming over our homeland, and that's really what the First Nations are saying. I remember going to speak with Premier Campbell about what was going on in the north, and I admired the Premier, but I was astonished to learn he had never been in the northwest quadrant of British Columbia. I was astonished to learn that he didn't know that Barrick Gold, for example, had taken 400 tons of gold and 5,000 tons of silver out of Tahltan country, land that had never come to treaty, that is by all evidence and British jurisprudence still technically land of the Tahltan, and at a market value today of $25 billion. But if you go to the community of Iskut, where I live, a place where a friend once said 45 suicides and me and my sister stopped counting, in the 10 years that that mine operated, there was not a single improvement in the infrastructure of that community. No hockey rink, no swimming pool, no trust funds for kids to go to college, no trust funds for small businesses to pop up, no elders center and so on. So a lot of the sentiment in the north is if we're going to have these developments, how many, at what rate, and for whose benefit? And there's a very overwhelming sense among the First Nations. They don't want to be cut out of the action once again.
Okay, let's broaden our picture here, and Philippe, I want to bring you in right now. One of the reasons we're having this debate is because I think about 99% of our oil exports go to the United States, and the government of Canada, in its wisdom, has decided that that's too much and we need to diversify our markets in this country. So, where else should we be looking?
Well, again, you can look at it from a very basic business perspective. If you have one customer, and in that customer represent 99% of your sale, everyone would say it would be a good idea to have at least a few more customers. So to us, it's very logical looking at diversifying, particularly with a resource that has tremendous value right now in the global marketplace. So so diversifying to the Asian market to us makes total sense. To get there, you need a pipeline. The pipeline is the best way to go about it. So what the government is saying is, frankly, what the industry has been actually working on for many years, because if you remember, the Northern Gateway project started 8-9 years ago. The existing Trans Mountain system has been looking at expanding its system for many, many years. This is not something new. This is just responding to markets. And now I think what we are seeing is that we are realizing that there's a strategic resource that has tremendous value, that is going to bring tremendous value to Canadians, ultimately, because this is ultimately what it's going to happen. Create that prosperity that is so needed for us to be able to, frankly, keep our lifestyle and that we so much cherished.
Well, let me ask Jenna right beside you. You know, there was an op-ed in one of the newspapers in this country, I guess about a week or so ago. I think Eddie Goldenberg, Jean Chrétien's former senior advisor, and Derek Burney, the former chief of staff to Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, both of whom said, you know, we don't actually have to do this. It'll be a little more expensive and it'll take a little longer if we ship the oil east, but we can still make that work and get it to Asia that way. Is that an option in your view?
Well, our position as producers is really that the market will determine where the oil needs to go and where its best home is. But it just seemed to defy a bit of logic that we would ship Western Canadian crude oil to Eastern Canada. And by the way, it is also a fact that most of Eastern Canada today relies on crude imports from other countries, from the North Sea, from Nigeria, from Saudi Arabia. So as Canadians, we're actually not supplying at this point even our own markets fully. So we have an opportunity there. It does defy logic to some degree, though, that we would go to the trouble of exporting. If the issue is tankers, then why would you have more tankers off of the East Coast? If the issue is tankers, why would you then put crude oil and bitumen on tankers that are going to go through the Panama Canal? So, you know, I defer to Susan, Casey Lefkowitz on maybe what that means environmentally and what NRDC's response to that type of proposal.
Well, that's a good idea. I want to get Susan on a follow-up on that, but before we do that, you said, we're going to let the markets decide. It actually may not be the markets, right? It might be politics that decides this. In which case, where does that leave you?
Well, I think that in the case where it's politics, we have our due diligence. As Canadians, our position to try to interfere in the U.S. political system it does not exist. So we've got to educate, we've got to talk about the environmental regulation, we've got to talk about the voluntary measures, the technologies, the practices that Canadian producers have in place today that are world leading. They are the best in the world. They're better than Venezuela, they're better than Nigeria, they're better than Mexico. Insofar as the United States is going to continue to use oil, we believe that the Canadian value proposition is there, that the Canadian product has a strong value proposition, and that's our role. That market will decide. And local communities, whether it's Nebraska or whether it's the United States as a whole, can determine very much what's in their national interest. Likewise, Canada can determine what's in its.
Well, Susan, if in fact, they need our power and we have a way of getting it to them, is the suggestion on the table today, while you may not like it, the least environmentally hazardous way of doing it? Presumably you don't want bitumen and tankers going through eastern Canada either.
When you mentioned diversification, the first thing that came to my mind is diversification of the kinds of energy that we use, and also making sure that we're just reducing our dependence on oil. And we have great examples of how we are already doing this. This is not something for the future. As people in Ontario well know, Ontario has been a real leader in clean energy, in shutting down coal plants and in building clean energy capacity. There's also been great partnership with the United States on fuel efficiency standards, which have really revived our automobile industry. I think that a big part of the revival that you see and the jobs that you see going into the auto industry has been because of fuel efficiency standards, which in turn have reduced our dependence on oil. But one thing that I wanted to pick up on that Janet mentioned, this idea that somehow Canada is not interfering in the policies of other countries is just untrue. There has been example after example of the Canadian federal government and the multinational oil industry going after and trying to undermine attempts in California, the northeast of the US, and in Europe to develop clean fuel standards. And they do this to protect the tar sands oil industry. And so what we really see is tar sands becoming a driver, not just for having more greenhouse gas emissions, but actually for undermining attempts to build clean energy and to fight climate change. And that's really not acceptable in a world where, as Wade said, climate change is one of the major threats that we face every day.
I really would like to respond.
All right, Philippe, go ahead.
Respond to this.
We've got less than 2 minutes, so go ahead, Philippe.
No, what I would like to say, I think it's perfectly, in my view, acceptable for Canada to have made a decision that the oil sands is a strategic asset to that country, to our country, and that we are going to try to promote that particular asset. It would be the same as if we were in Quebec and we are promoting water. It would be the same thing. We have, as a country, certain endowments that we want to use that we believe can provide great value to our own society. And from that perspective, I think we have to do this to promote it and to also, frankly, to protect it. So I think this idea that we are undermining the political process in other countries, I don't think I look at it that way. We are promoting our own interests, by the way, like any other country is doing the same thing at this point right now. All of us are living in a competitive world. All of us are looking for energy. Some of us are lucky enough to have that energy that we would like to sell to others, and it's actually, frankly, incumbent upon us to do so.
Okay, let me save 30 seconds for Wade. That's all I got, Wade, is 30 seconds. I want to know if there's a compromise here, or is it either it isn't going to happen or it is going to happen? Is there a middle ground?
Well, I think there has to be a middle ground because the oil sands, the tar sands are not going away. Alberta is 25% of the known reserves of the world. I would say that I would be cautious in linking the kind of royal we as we Canadians to the fate of the tar sands or the fate of the oil industry in general, because there are a lot of Canadians like myself who look somewhat skeptically on the interests of the those who are controlling the oil sands. And we in Northwest British Columbia in particular are deeply concerned about the impact on our country of peripheral projects that are being put into place specifically, for example, to bring coal bed methane gas to fuel the tar sands. So there has to be a solution. The tar sands are not going away.
But we are, I'm afraid, Wade. Forgive me. I said 30 seconds and we're right out of time. I want to thank all our guests for participating in such a civilized debate about a controversial issue. Wade Davis, National Geographic Society. Susan Casey-Lefkowitz, also in Washington, D.C., from the NRDC. Philippe Riker from the Canadian Energy Pipeline Association in Calgary, and alongside him, Janet Ansley of CAP. Thanks so much, everybody, for participating tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.